As the sun began to dip behind the hills of the small town, a quiet sense of unease hung in the air. For months, the streets had been filled with whispers about the upcoming deployment, and now the day had finally come. The young man stood outside his family's house, the familiar creak of the old porch underfoot offering some comfort. His heart was heavy, a mixture of pride and fear swirling inside him. He had made the decision to join the military a year ago, a decision that had changed everything. Now the time had come to leave. His mother stood in the doorway trying to hold back tears. She had known this moment was coming but had never imagined it would be so difficult. Her son, her only child, was about to step into a world far removed from the safety and warmth of home. She had raised him with all the love and care she could give, but she knew that no matter how much she had prepared him, this would be something entirely new. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her lips trembled as she reached out to him, pulling him into an embrace. She whispered in his ear, "Stay safe. Come back to us." He squeezed his mother tightly, promising her that he would be okay. The words didn't feel like enough, but they were all he could give. He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes one last time before turning to his father, who stood nearby with a solemn expression. The man had always been the strong, silent type, never one for outward displays of emotion. But today his shoulders seemed weighed down by something more than just the burden of his own thoughts. "Take care of yourself, son," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. The man cleared his throat and nodded, as if the words he wanted to say were stuck somewhere deep inside him. "Don't worry, Dad," the young man replied, forcing a smile. "I'll be back. I promise." His father didn't respond right away, his face tight. It was clear he was trying to hold it together, not wanting to break down in front of his son. After a long pause, he pulled him into a hug. The embrace was firm, unspoken strength passing between them. "I know you will," his father said softly, before stepping back and patting his son on the shoulder. The young man could feel the weight of those words, as if they carried the full weight of his father's hopes and fears, but he couldn't afford to show any doubt now. His time was running out, and he had made a promise he intended to keep. He turned to his best friend, a young woman who had been a constant presence in his life for years. She was standing a little off to the side, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she watched the scene unfold. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes, but she said nothing. He walked over to her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel as he approached. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice a little softer now. She nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, though it was clear she wasn't. He wanted to say more, to tell her how much he would miss her, how much he would think about her while he was away, but the words felt like they would be too much, too raw. Instead, he simply took her hand in his, holding it for a long moment. He could feel her trembling, and it made his heart ache. "I'll be back. I promise," he said again, the words more firm this time, as if saying them aloud would somehow make them true. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know." They stood like that for a while, the world around them fading into the background. The sound of birdsong, the hum of distant conversations, it all seemed distant and unreal. All that mattered in that moment was the quiet connection between them, the unspoken understanding that no matter what, they would be there for each other. Finally, with a deep breath, the young man released her hand, giving her one last look before turning away. He had to go now. His truck was waiting, and the next chapter of his life was about to begin. He climbed into the vehicle, the engine roaring to life as he turned the key. For a brief moment, he looked back at the people who had shaped his world, the people who loved him and the people he promised to return to. As the truck rolled down the gravel road, he felt a lump form in his throat. He had promised to come back, and it was a promise he intended to keep no matter what. But even as he set out on the journey ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same. The world was changing, and so was he. The promise he had made felt like both a burden and a beacon, something to hold on to when everything around him seemed uncertain. The road stretched out in front of him, long and winding. With each mile, the weight of the promise settled deeper into his chest, but he was determined. He had made a vow, and he wouldn't break it, no matter what. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The young man had seen things he couldn't have imagined when he left home. Each day brought a new challenge, a new battle, and a new reminder of how fragile life could be. He had never truly understood the weight of his promise until now. The faces of his family and friends were distant memories, often fading into the background as the harsh realities of war took center stage. Each morning, he would wake up to the sound of helicopters overhead, the heavy thrum of the engines vibrating through his chest. The camp he was stationed at was a mix of makeshift tents and hardened structures, surrounded by the endless expanse of dry desert. There was a constant undercurrent of tension in the air, as if everyone knew that danger was always just around the corner. No one dared to relax for too long because the next day might bring something worse. The first few weeks had been manageable. His platoon was still fresh, and there was a certain naivety in their faces, a belief that they could get through this with minimal loss. They had trained for months, gone through drills that prepared them for everything, or so they thought. But nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of combat. He had seen men his age, some even younger, fall around him. The first time it happened, he was frozen, unsure of what to do. His heart had raced, his stomach twisted, and his mind was overwhelmed by the shock of it all. His training had kicked in, and he had done what needed to be done, securing the area, checking for signs of survivors, keeping his head down. But inside, he felt a part of himself break with each passing day, the weight of what he had seen and done pressed down on him. The blood, the noise, the confusion. It was all a blur, a chaotic mess that seemed to erase any sense of normalcy from his mind. The letters he had sent back home, the promises he had made, felt like they belonged to someone else. How could he return to the peaceful life he had once known, when all he could see now were images of destruction? But through it all, he held on to that promise. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see her face, the woman he loved, and he could hear her words, soft and full of hope. Come back to me. It was the one thing that anchored him when everything else felt uncertain. Even in the darkest moments, when he thought he might not make it out, that promise kept him going. The other soldiers in his unit were going through their own struggles. Some tried to hide their fears, others dealt with them in different ways. There was one soldier who would constantly crack jokes, always trying to lighten the mood. But even his laughter felt forced at times. Another soldier became quiet, withdrawn, as if trying to shut the world out entirely. They all had their ways of coping, but no one spoke openly about the fear and sadness that were creeping into their hearts. He found himself looking forward to the letters he received, small glimpses of life back home that felt like a distant dream. Each letter, each word written by his partner was a lifeline. Her letters were filled with words of love and encouragement, but also with the small details of life back home. The smell of rain, the way the town looked during sunset, and the changes happening around them. It made him feel connected, even if only for a brief moment, but with every letter he also felt a pang of guilt. His partner had never asked him for anything but his safe return, yet he couldn't help but feel that he was failing her by being so far away. He was supposed to be there with her, protecting her, but instead, he was here in a foreign land, surrounded by strangers, facing enemies he couldn't even fully understand. The days grew longer and the nights became colder. The heat of the day would burn the skin, while the cold of the desert night would cut through even the thickest jackets. Time had become meaningless in the desert. Days and nights blurred together, and the constant march of time felt like an unending cycle. Every day felt like a test, every hour a struggle to stay focused and alive. One evening, after a particularly intense skirmish with enemy forces, he sat alone in the mess tent, his mind racing. The sound of explosions still echoed in his ears, and his hands trembled from the adrenaline that had coursed through him only hours before. The others were laughing and talking, but he couldn't join in. The laughter seemed so far away, so alien to the place he was in now. He looked at the letter he had just received from his partner, the familiar handwriting bringing a sense of calm to his racing thoughts. She had written about a small festival happening back home, the way the whole town had come together to celebrate. He could almost hear the laughter and music, the chatter of friends and neighbors. The contrast between her words and his reality was stark, and it hit him harder than he expected. In that moment, he realized just how much he had changed. The young man who had left this town full of hope and promise was no longer the same. The war had taken pieces of him, pieces he wasn't sure he could ever get back. But there was one thing he could still hold on to, the promise he had made. No matter what he faced, no matter how much he had changed, he would keep that promise. He would return. He had to. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his pocket, and stood up, walking outside into the cool desert night. The stars were bright above him, a vast, silent reminder of how small he felt in the grand scheme of the world. But even in that vast emptiness, he knew something that no amount of fear or pain could take away. He had promised to return, and he wasn't about to let anything stand in his way. As he stared up at the sky, he thought about the day he would finally come home. It felt like a dream, a distant hope that he couldn't quite touch, but he clung to it knowing that it was the one thing that could keep him going. No matter how hard the war got, no matter how many obstacles he faced, he would find his way back to her. He had to. The days ahead would bring more challenges, more moments that tested him in ways he couldn't predict. But as long as he held on to that promise, he knew he would never lose his way. He would return. The months had worn on, and the young man found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. At first he had focused only on survival, the need to get through each day, each mission, without thinking too much about what came after. But somewhere along the way, survival had turned into something deeper. It wasn't just about getting by anymore. It was about holding on to the person he used to be, the person who had made a promise to return home. There were days when the war felt endless, and the sound of gunfire and explosions became a constant hum in the background. He had grown used to the constant tension, the feeling that danger could strike at any moment. His senses had sharpened. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the air seemed to hold some hidden meaning. The soldiers around him had become like family, sharing their fears and frustrations in quiet moments when they could afford to rest. But even in the midst of all this chaos, there was one thing that never left his mind. Her. He had promised her he would return, and that promise became the anchor that kept him grounded. In the darkest moments when it felt like hope was slipping away, he would close his eyes and imagine her face, hear her voice in his mind, and remember the way she looked at him when they said goodbye. Every letter he received from her brought both comfort and pain. Her words were full of hope, but they also carried the weight of the time that had passed. She would write about the small things that kept her going, how the town had changed, how the flowers in the garden bloomed, and how she had kept busy with work and life. She never spoke directly of how much she missed him, but he could feel it in the spaces between her words. Her letters were a lifeline, a connection to the world he had left behind. They reminded him that his promise mattered, that someone was waiting for him, believing that he would come back. The young man held on to that belief with everything he had. It was the one thing he could control in a world that often felt like it was spiraling out of control. No matter what happened in the days to come, he had made a promise and he would keep it. There was no other option. One day, after a particularly difficult mission, the young man found himself sitting alone in the mess tent, staring at the letter he had just received. The words on the page seemed to blur together as his mind wandered. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but he couldn't stop thinking about the future that felt so uncertain. How much longer would he have to endure this? How much longer could he keep the promise? A loud voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, you good?" It was one of his fellow soldiers, a man who had become a close friend in the months they had spent together. His voice was rough, but there was a softness to it now, something that hadn't been there when they first met. War had a way of changing people, of making them see things differently. The young man didn't respond right away. He just nodded, trying to push the weight of his thoughts aside. "You don't look good," his friend said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from him. "What's going on? You're not yourself lately." The young man sighed and leaned back, rubbing his face. "It's nothing, just tired." His friend raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Tired of what?" "Tired of all this," the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of the waiting, of not knowing when it will end. It's hard to hold on when everything feels like it's falling apart." His friend was silent for a moment, staring at him with a look that was equal parts understanding and concern. Then he reached across the table, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You're not alone in this," he said. "We've all been through it. It gets easier sometimes, harder at others. But you can't give up. Not when there's something waiting for you." The young man looked up, meeting his friend's eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." But the truth was, the weight of it was becoming harder to carry. Every day felt like a test of his strength, his willpower, and his belief that he could make it through. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his heart racing, feeling as though the walls were closing in. The sounds of explosions would echo in his mind, and for a moment he would forget where he was. He would forget everything except the overwhelming sense of fear. The young man had seen too much to feel safe anymore. The war had taken a toll on him that no one could see. His body had become hardened, but his mind felt like it was constantly on the edge. He knew it wasn't just the war that was weighing on him. It was the promise to return. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear her voice again, soft and warm. "Come back to me." It was the one thing that kept him moving forward, but it was also the one thing that filled him with so much fear. What if he couldn't keep it? What if the war took everything from him? His strength, his will, his ability to hold on to the future they had planned. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the camp, the young man found himself walking alone, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air was cooler now, but the weight of the day still pressed on him. He had learned to walk like this, alone, with his thoughts as his only companion. The soldiers around him had become used to their own solitude, each one fighting their own battles in silence. He reached the edge of the camp, where the view opened up to the barren landscape beyond. The desert stretched out before him, a vast expanse of nothingness. But in the distance, the faintest hint of light shone on the horizon. For a moment it felt like the world had paused, as if time itself had stopped to let him breathe. In that moment he closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. The wind carried a faint scent of dust and earth, but it also carried with it something else, a reminder of home. He imagined her, standing there in the garden, the light from the setting sun painting her face. He could almost feel her hand in his, the warmth of her touch. The young man stood there for a long time, the promise echoing in his mind. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't give up now. The promise was everything. It was the reason he kept fighting, the reason he kept breathing. The sun dipped below the horizon, and with it a new day began. A day that, no matter what, would bring him one step closer to fulfilling the promise he had made. The days stretched on in a blur of heat and dust. The young man had grown used to the rhythm of life in the camp. Wake up early, gear up, complete the mission, and return to base, only to do it all over again the next day. He had become numb to the constant noise of gunfire in the distance, the hum of helicopters overhead, and the stench of sweat and smoke that clung to everything. Each day felt like a replay of the one before, and yet each one carried with it a unique set of challenges. He had seen enough death to last a lifetime. Every day the camp lost soldiers, and the young man found himself growing more detached from the world he had once known. But through it all there was one thing he held on to: the promise. Every night before he closed his eyes he would think of her, the woman he loved. Her face, her voice, her touch, these were the things that kept him grounded. And every time he thought about her, he reminded himself that no matter how hard it got, no matter how dark the days seemed, he would keep that promise. He would return. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the weight of the war seemed too much to bear. The fear that he might never make it home was always there, lurking in the back of his mind. The young man had been through so much, seen so many things he couldn't unsee. He had lost friends, comrades, men who had stood beside him, who had shared in the struggle. The grief of their loss was like a shadow that never left him. Some days it felt like he was carrying the world on his shoulders, and the promise seemed like a distant dream. But despite everything, he kept moving forward. He clung to that promise with everything he had. It was the only thing that gave him purpose now. One day, after a particularly grueling mission, the young man found himself sitting on the edge of a rocky outcrop, staring out into the vast desert that stretched endlessly before him. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The heat of the day was fading, but the weight of the war still pressed down on him. He had just received another letter from her. Her words were full of love and hope, but there was something else in her letters now, a quiet sadness, a fear that hadn't been there before. In every letter, she spoke of the small things, the way the garden was blooming, how the neighborhood was quiet, and how much she missed him. But there was always a line at the end, a line that said more than words ever could. "I'm counting the days until you come back." The young man folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his pocket. His fingers lingered on the paper for a moment before he stood up, his legs stiff from hours of sitting. The desert stretched out before him, a reminder of how far he had come, how far he still had to go. It had been so long since he had last seen her, since he had last held her. The thought of it gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on it, not now. The mission had to come first. The war had to come first. If he let his mind wander too much, if he let the fear creep in, he wouldn't be able to do his job. He wouldn't be able to return. But as the days wore on, it became harder and harder to push aside those thoughts. Every mission felt like a step closer to the end, but it also felt like a step closer to losing everything. The soldiers around him were beginning to crack under the pressure. Some had started to drink more. Others were becoming increasingly irritable. The young man understood. He could feel the pressure building inside him, a pressure that threatened to overwhelm him at any moment. One afternoon, during a break in the action, he found himself walking along a narrow path that led away from the camp. The air was dry, the heat oppressive, but he needed the space. He needed to be alone with his thoughts. As he walked, his mind drifted back to the day he had left home. The memory of her face, the way she had smiled at him, the way she had promised she would wait, that memory had become both a comfort and a burden. He had thought he could handle the separation, thought he could endure the loneliness, but now with each passing day, the distance between them felt like an insurmountable wall. The promise to return seemed like an impossible goal, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the facade. The path he was walking on ended at a small ridge, where he stopped to look out over the desert once again. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. It was beautiful in a way, the endless stretch of sand, the way the light seemed to change the color of everything it touched. But it was also empty, barren, like the space inside him that had once been filled with hope. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see one of his fellow soldiers approaching, a man who had become a close friend over the past months. "You okay?" the man asked, his voice low and hesitant. The young man hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to admit how much he was struggling, how much the weight of everything was starting to get to him. But he also knew that sometimes it helped to talk. "I'm fine," he said, though it was a lie. His friend didn't seem convinced. "You sure? You've been distant lately. It's getting to everyone I know, but it seems like it's hitting you harder than the rest of us." The young man looked out at the desert again, the vast emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. I'm tired. I'm tired of all of this. I'm tired of fighting, of wondering when it will end. And I'm tired of not being able to promise anything anymore." His friend was silent for a moment, then stepped closer, resting a hand on the young man's shoulder. "I get it," he said quietly. "But you can't give up now. You've got a reason to fight, a reason to keep going." The word struck a chord in the young man's chest. It was true. He had a reason to keep fighting her. The promise he had made to return to her. That was the only thing keeping him from giving up. "I know," he said, his voice thick. "I just wish it didn't feel like it's all slipping away sometimes." "Don't let it slip," his friend said, giving him a firm pat on the back. "You've got something to come back to." "We all do." The young man nodded, his heart a little lighter. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going, but in that moment he realized something. The promise wasn't just something he had made to her. It was something he had made to himself, and he wasn't about to let that promise fade away. The sun was lower now, casting a dim golden light over the camp. The young man stood at the edge of his tent, staring out into the distance. The past months had been grueling. Each day had felt longer than the last, and yet, as he looked out at the horizon, it felt like time had slipped away without him even noticing. The promise that had once seemed so simple, so full of hope, had become the thread that held him together. And now, standing here, he could feel it. He was closer than ever to keeping that promise. It had been a long time since he had heard from her. The last letter had been a few weeks ago, and even then he could feel the tension in her words. Her letters had always been full of love and warmth, but this one had carried a weight that he hadn't expected. She hadn't said it outright, but he could tell that she too was beginning to doubt. The long silence between them was starting to wear on both of them. She missed him. She was waiting for him, but the distance between them had grown, and yet she never stopped believing. The thought of her waiting for him, counting the days until his return, was what kept him going. In all the chaos and destruction, her belief in him was the only thing that still felt real. No matter how much the war had changed him, no matter how much he had seen and done, he knew he couldn't let her down. He had promised. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. There was a restlessness inside him now, something he couldn't shake. The war was still raging and there was still work to be done. But the mission, the soldiers around him, all of it felt like background noise compared to the call of home, the call of the life he had left behind. For the first time in months, he began to wonder what it would be like to walk down the streets of his hometown again, to hear the sound of birds in the trees, to feel the warmth of the sun without the constant threat of danger hanging overhead. He imagined her waiting for him at the front door, her arms open wide, ready to embrace him like she had promised she would. But that thought, as much as it filled him with hope, also brought a new kind of fear. What if he wasn't the same when he returned? What if the war had changed him in ways he couldn't fix? He had seen men come home broken, their eyes haunted by the things they had experienced. He couldn't let that happen to him. Not when there was so much at stake. He shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. There would be time for that later, he told himself. Right now, he needed to focus on the mission ahead. He couldn't afford to let his mind wander too far from the task at hand. The war had a way of pulling you in, making you forget what was real. It had a way of making you believe that there was nothing but the fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something else. A sense of determination. A sense that he wasn't alone in this, that he had something to fight for. Later that night, after the camp had settled into its usual quiet routine, the young man sat alone by the small campfire, the crackling of the flames a comforting sound in the stillness. He had spent the evening going through the motions, checking his gear, cleaning his rifle, and preparing for the next day. But his mind was elsewhere. It was with her. Always with her. His hand reached into his pocket and he pulled out the letter she had sent him. It was old now, the paper slightly worn from being carried in his pocket for so long. The words were still clear, still fresh in his mind, but he read them again anyway. Each word, each sentence was a reminder of the life he was fighting for, the life that was waiting for him. "I'm counting the days," she had written, "and I'll be here when you come back. No matter how long it takes." Those words had always meant so much to him, but now, as he read them again, they carried an even deeper weight. He couldn't fail her. Not when she had placed so much faith in him. Not when she had waited so long. As the fire flickered and the night settled around him, the young man realized something. The promise wasn't just about returning to her. It wasn't just about coming back home to the life he had known. It was about showing her that he hadn't forgotten. It was about proving to both of them that love could survive even the darkest of times, that even in the face of war, even in the face of everything that had tried to tear him apart, he could still keep that one promise. The next morning, the young man received word that the mission was about to end. It was finally over. The fighting had subsided, and the soldiers were to be sent home. He could hardly believe it. After all the struggles, all the pain, it was finally coming to an end. As he packed his things, the weight of it all started to sink in. He was going home. He was going back to her. The thought seemed almost too good to be true. He had thought about this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to feel. Was he ready? Would everything be the same? The young man found himself standing at the edge of the camp, looking out into the distance. The sun was rising, casting a warm light over the barren landscape. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The war was behind him. The mission was done. And now, all that mattered was the journey home. As he climbed onto the transport plane that would take him back, his heart raced. The reality of what was happening began to sink in. He was going home. The promise he had made was no longer a distant hope. It was about to be fulfilled. The journey felt endless, each mile taking him closer to the life he had left behind. The hours stretched on, but with every passing moment, the excitement grew. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, they all faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the promise he had made. When the plane finally touched down, the young man couldn't believe it. He was home. The air was cooler here, the sky a little more open. He could hear the sound of birds in the distance, the familiar hum of life that had gone on without him. He stepped off the plane, his boots hitting the ground with a sense of finality. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. And there she was, standing at the end of the runway, her face lit by the soft glow of the setting sun. She had been waiting for him just as she had promised. He ran toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. And when they finally reached each other, when their arms wrapped around one another, everything that had come before, the war, the struggles, the doubts, melted away. The promise had been kept. He had returned. And in that moment, everything felt right again. The days after his return were filled with a strange mixture of emotions. For the first time in months, the young man had the chance to sleep in a real bed, to feel the soft sheets against his skin, to listen to the quiet hum of life outside his window. It should have been a comfort, but instead it felt disorienting. The world outside his bedroom window was peaceful, too peaceful compared to the chaos he had just left behind. He was home, and yet nothing felt quite the same. His partner was always there, offering a comforting presence whenever he needed it, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She had waited for him. She had kept the faith that he would return, and now that he was back, it felt as though they were both learning how to navigate a new reality together. The first few nights were the hardest. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The images of the battlefield would still be fresh in his mind. Faces of men he had lost, the noise of gunfire, the smell of dust and blood. In the stillness of his room, those memories would rush back, and he would find himself trapped in the past, unable to escape. His partner noticed the changes in him before anyone else. She could see the way his eyes would glaze over, as though he were somewhere else, and how he would pull away when she tried to talk to him about it. She had always been his strength, but now he felt like a stranger to himself. The man who had left was full of hope, full of life, but the man who returned seemed weighed down by something invisible. One evening, after a particularly difficult night, the young man found himself standing by the window, staring out at the quiet streets. The city had moved on without him, life continuing as if the war had never happened. It felt like a dream, something he couldn't quite touch. He had survived the war, but at what cost? He had made a promise to return, and now that he was back, he wasn't sure if he was the man he once was. His partner came up behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. She knew what he was thinking, and he knew that she had been waiting for him to open up, to let her in. "I'm here," she said softly, her voice a whisper in the quiet room. "You don't have to carry this alone." The young man closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He wanted to tell her everything, to let her see the fear, the confusion, the pain that he had been carrying with him. But it was hard. He had spent so long building walls around himself, shutting everyone out. He had convinced himself that he could handle it alone, that he could keep the darkness at bay without anyone else knowing. But now, as he stood there, with her standing beside him, he realized that he couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't keep burying everything inside. The war had changed him, and it wasn't something he could just erase. He had to face it. He had to face the truth of what he had been through, what it had done to him. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I don't know how to be the person I was before." His partner turned him around gently, her hands on his face as she looked into his eyes. "You don't have to be the person you were before. You're still you. You've just been through something that no one should ever have to go through, but you're not alone. We'll figure this out together." The young man felt the weight of her words, the promise of support in her voice. He had always been strong, always been the one to protect those he loved, but now he was the one who needed protecting. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. He let go of the fear that had been holding him back, and in doing so, he felt a small piece of the burden lift. They spent the next few hours talking, slowly, carefully. He told her about the things he had seen, the faces of his fallen comrades, the terror of being in the middle of a firefight, the constant fear that every day could be his last. He told her about the guilt that had gnawed at him, the feeling that he hadn't done enough, that he had failed to save those who were lost. She listened, never interrupting, never trying to fix him. She let him speak, let him get the words out even though it hurt, and when he was finished, she held him, letting him rest against her, knowing that the healing would take time. It wouldn't be easy. There would be days when he would feel like he was drowning in his thoughts. Days when the past would feel like it was swallowing him whole. But with her, he knew that he didn't have to face it alone. The next few weeks were a slow, difficult process. The young man started attending therapy, something he never thought he would need. It was strange at first, sitting in a room with a stranger talking about his feelings. But as time passed, he began to understand the importance of confronting his trauma, of allowing himself to heal. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but learning how to live with it, how to move forward. There were still moments when the memories would resurface, when the nightmares would return. But each time he felt a little stronger. He was no longer defined by the war. He was more than what had happened to him. He had a future, a life to rebuild, and he wasn't going to let the past control him forever. His partner was with him every step of the way, supporting him through the darkest days and celebrating the smallest victories. They found joy in the simple things again. Long walks in the park, quiet evenings at home, laughter over dinner. He had returned to her, but he was also returning to himself, little by little. The promise he had made was no longer just about getting home. It was about becoming whole again. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. But as time passed, the young man found peace. He learned to live with the scars the war had left on him, both the ones others could see and the ones buried deep inside. He understood now that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding a way to move forward without leaving the past behind. One evening, as the sun began to set, he and his partner stood together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. He took her hand, squeezing it gently, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. "I'm here," he said quietly, "and I'm going to stay." She smiled, her eyes soft with love and understanding. "I know," she said. "I've always known." And for the first time, the young man believed it. He had made a promise to return, and now he had made a promise to stay. And with that promise, he could finally move forward, knowing that no matter what the future held, he wasn't alone. The days grew longer, and with each passing week, the young man felt himself reconnecting with the life he had almost lost. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but it wasn't the overwhelming presence it had once been. Instead, it had become something he could carry, something he could live with, and in a strange way that felt like a victory. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the past crept up on him, when the memories would rush in without warning, flooding his mind with the faces and the sounds that haunted him. Some nights the nightmares would return, and he would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. But those moments were becoming fewer, and when they did come, he wasn't as afraid. He had learned how to face them, how to breathe through them, and more importantly, he had learned that he didn't have to face them alone. His partner was always there, a constant source of comfort and strength. They had become a team again, learning how to navigate the quiet moments of life together, rebuilding their relationship one step at a time. The love between them had always been strong, but now it was deeper, forged in the fire of everything they had been through. She was his anchor, the one thing he knew he could count on, and in turn, he was learning to be there for her in ways he hadn't been able to before. One morning they went for a walk in the park, a place they had frequented before he had left. The sun was shining, the air crisp with the promise of fall, and the sounds of children playing in the distance filled the air with a sense of normalcy. As they walked, the young man couldn't help but notice how much he had changed. The world around him was the same, but he was not. He had come back from war, and though he had tried to hold on to the man he had been, he realized now that he had become something new. Something stronger, perhaps, but also more fragile in a way. The war had taken its toll on him, but it had also taught him the value of the things he once took for granted: love, peace, the simple moments of everyday life. His partner reached for his hand as they strolled, her fingers intertwining with his. They walked in silence for a while, both of them content in the quiet, in the peace of being together again. For the first time in months, the young man felt like he was truly home, not just in his surroundings, but in himself. He had come back, yes, but now he was learning how to stay, how to embrace the future rather than being consumed by the past. "You're quiet today," she said, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "What's on your mind?" The young man smiled, though it was small, and shook his head slightly. Just thinking about how far I've come, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. How much has changed, how much has stayed the same. She looked at him with a gentle understanding. It's okay to be different now, she said. It's okay to change. We don't have to go back to what we were before. We can build something new, something better. The words struck a chord in him. For so long he had been fixated on the idea of returning to the man he was before the war. But he had come to realize that it wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward. About growing, healing, and finding new ways to love, to live, and to be. Later that week they visited his family, a long overdue gathering that had been postponed countless times during his time away. His parents welcomed him with open arms, their love unconditional, though there were still traces of concern in their eyes. They had always been proud of him, but they had never fully understood the weight of what he had endured. No one could. The young man found himself sitting in the living room, surrounded by familiar faces, but feeling like a stranger in his own home. The conversations flowed around him, light and easy, but his mind kept drifting back to the past. The laughter of his siblings, the sound of his mother's voice, the smell of his father's cooking, all of it felt comforting, but also distant, like it belonged to someone else. His mother noticed the quietness in his eyes and came over to sit beside him. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering him the kind of warmth that only a mother could give. "You don't have to pretend, you know," she said softly. "We see you. We know you're not the same. And that's okay. We're just glad you're here." The young man looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had always known his family loved him, but now it felt different. Their love was a steady reminder that no matter what he had been through, no matter how much he had changed, he still had a place here. He was still part of something bigger than himself. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just trying to figure it all out. It's harder than I thought it would be." She smiled, squeezing his arm gently. "We're here for you, always." The rest of the evening passed in a haze of conversation, laughter, and shared meals. The young man found himself relaxing, slowly letting go of the tension he had been carrying for so long. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to find his way again. The road ahead would be long, but at least he didn't have to walk it alone. A few days later, he received a call that changed everything. It was a simple phone call, but it carried with it a weight that he hadn't been prepared for. His old platoon leader, the one who had been with him from the beginning, had passed away. It wasn't from combat, but from the toll the war had taken on him, mental and physical. The news hit the young man like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had lost so many friends during the war, but this one, this loss, felt different. It felt personal. It reminded him of everything he had tried so hard to forget. But as the news settled in, something else stirred within him, a sense of resolve, a quiet understanding that his journey wasn't over yet. His friend's death wasn't in vain. He had to honor it, honor all of them, the ones who never made it back. That evening, he sat down with his partner and told her everything, his grief, his anger, his sense of loss. She listened, never interrupting, simply being there with him, allowing him to speak the words he had been holding in. And when he was done, she didn't try to make him feel better. She simply held him, and in that moment, he knew that he was healing. Slowly, but surely, the promise he had made to return was no longer just about coming home. It was about honoring those who couldn't come back. It was about living fully, without letting the darkness of the past define him. And with that understanding, the young man felt a new strength building inside him, the strength to keep going, to keep living, to keep honoring those he had lost along the way. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But with each day, he found himself growing stronger, more whole. And as he looked into his partner's eyes, he knew that no matter what, he was finally on the path toward healing.